The Israel and Palestine conflict is one of the most argued over struggles in the modern world. For some, it is about ancient promises and biblical rights. For others, it is about colonial borders and broken treaties. Each side claims history. Each side claims justice. And each side remembers the dead. What is certain is that no other conflict combines so much religion, nationalism, and geopolitics into one. From the fall of ancient kingdoms, to the Crusades, to centuries under the Ottoman Empire, to the British Mandate, and to the wars of 1948 and 1967, the land has changed rulers repeatedly. Today, more than 7 million Israelis and more than 5 million Palestinians live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Both claim it as their homeland. Both have lost tens of thousands of lives in war and violence, and both still carry a narrative of injustice. This documentary will not give you slogans. It will not choose a side. It will trace the evidence through maps, wars, treaties, and historical records from the earliest history until today. Only then can we separate myth from reality and see how a conflict that began long before our lifetimes still shapes the modern world. The land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea has carried many names. In different periods, it was called Canaan, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the Roman province of Judea, Byzantine Palestine, and later under Islamic rule, Palestine. What never changed was that multiple peoples lived here, and power shifted often. Around 1000 BCE, the Hebrew kingdoms of Israel and Judah emerged. Jerusalem became a religious and political center. These kingdoms fell to larger empires. Assyria destroyed Israel in 722 BCE, and Babylon destroyed Judah in 586 BCE, sending much of its population into exile. The Jewish temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, but a remnant community survived. When the Persians conquered Babylon, they allowed Jews to return and rebuild. This established a long record of Jewish presence, even under foreign rule. In 63 BCE, Rome conquered the region. Jewish revolts against Rome in 70 CE, and again in 132 CE, ended with disaster. The Second Temple was destroyed, and many Jews were killed or sold into slavery. Rome renamed the province Syria Palestina, a name derived from the ancient Philistines, partly to sever Jewish ties to the land. Still, not all Jews left. Archaeological and written evidence shows continuous Jewish communities in Galilee, Jerusalem, and along the coast. By the 4th century CE, Christianity had become dominant under the Byzantine Empire. Jerusalem and Bethlehem became centers for Christian pilgrimage. After 638 CE, Arab Muslim armies took the region from Byzantium. Under the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates, Arabic language and Islam spread, though Jews and Christians continued to live there under dhimma status, meaning they were allowed to practice their religion but under certain restrictions. From this point onward, the population was mixed: Arabic-speaking Muslims, Christian minorities, and surviving Jewish communities. In summary, the earliest history of the land shows repeated cycles. Native kingdoms rose and fell, empires conquered, religions reshaped the society. Yet both Jewish and non-Jewish populations maintained roots. This dual continuity of Jewish presence and Arab development is the historical foundation of today's conflict. From 1517 until the First World War, the land was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. It was administered not as a separate state, but as part of larger provincial systems. First Damascus, later Beirut, and Jerusalem as a special district by the 19th century. During most of these centuries, the region was a quiet frontier of empire, not the center of global politics. The population was diverse. The majority were Arabic-speaking Muslims, but there were also Christian communities including Greek Orthodox, Armenian, and Latin Catholic, as well as Jewish communities concentrated in cities such as Jerusalem, Hebron, Tiberias, and Safed. Records from Ottoman tax registers confirm that Jews maintained a continuous presence, usually as a minority. At the same time, Arab, Muslim, and Christian peasants farmed villages across the hills and plains. By the middle of the 19th century, the total population was about 500,000. The 19th century brought major changes. The Ottoman Tanzimat reforms attempted to modernize administration, reorganize land ownership, and centralize authority. This led to new patterns of land registration, sometimes displacing peasants who lacked formal deeds. It also created opportunities for land purchases by wealthy families in cities and by foreign groups. Global forces were also shifting. European powers gained influence, often under the pretext of protecting Christian or Jewish communities. Russia claimed a role for Orthodox Christians, France for Catholics, and Britain for Jews and Protestants. These interventions connected local communities to international politics. The late 19th century also saw the beginnings of two national movements. In Europe, political Zionism arose, calling for Jewish return to the ancestral homeland, partly as a response to persecution and pogroms. Early Jewish immigrants began arriving in Palestine in organized waves known as aliyot. They purchased land, often from absentee landlords, and established agricultural settlements. These newcomers brought Hebrew revival and new institutions, but also tensions with local Arab villagers who sometimes lost access to land. An Arab cultural and political awakening was also underway. Intellectuals in Beirut, Damascus, and Jerusalem developed new ideas of Arab identity. By the early 20th century, many local Arabs saw themselves as part of a wider Arab nation, while also defending their ties to Palestine. Newspapers, schools, and political societies spread these ideas. By 1914, the stage was set. The land had centuries of Ottoman governance, a growing mix of Arab nationalism, and the first organized Jewish political settlement movement. When the First World War erupted, these local dynamics collided with global conflict, reshaping the region permanently. The First World War transformed the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers and collapsed under the pressure of Allied campaigns. In 1917, British forces under General Allenby entered Jerusalem, marking the end of 4 centuries of Ottoman rule. But even before the fighting ended, Britain had made conflicting promises about the future of the land. In 1915-1916, British officials corresponded with Sharif Hussein of Mecca, promising support for an independent Arab kingdom if he led an Arab revolt against the Ottomans. At the same time, Britain and France secretly negotiated the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, dividing much of the Ottoman Middle East into spheres of influence. Then, in November 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, announcing support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, while stating that the rights of existing non-Jewish communities should not be harmed. These overlapping commitments created contradictions that would not be resolved. After the war, the League of Nations granted Britain the mandate for Palestine in 1922. The mandate incorporated the Balfour Declaration, giving international recognition to the Jewish national home. For Jews, this was a breakthrough. Immigration increased, new settlements were founded, and institutions like the Jewish Agency and the Haganah militia developed. For Arabs, it was a betrayal. They had expected independence, and instead, they saw growing land sales, demographic change, and a British administration that many believe favored Zionist aims. Tensions erupted in violence. In 1920 and 1921, riots broke out in Jerusalem and Jaffa. In 1929, violence spread after disputes over access to the Western Wall, leaving hundreds of Jews and Arabs dead. The 1930s saw escalating conflict. The Arab Revolt of 1936-1939 targeted both British rule and Jewish immigration. The British responded with harsh repression, executing rebels, demolishing homes, and exiling leaders. At the same time, Jewish defense groups expanded, further militarizing the conflict. As Europe moved toward another war, the stakes rose. With persecution of Jews intensifying under Nazi Germany, pressure for immigration to Palestine grew. But in 1939, Britain issued the White Paper, restricting Jewish immigration to appease Arab opposition. This decision, made on the eve of the Holocaust, remains one of the most controversial policies of the mandate. By 1945, Palestine was a land in turmoil. Jewish survivors of the Holocaust seeking refuge, Arab Palestinians demanding independence, and Britain caught in the middle of a conflict it could no longer control. After the Second World War, the conflict in Palestine reached breaking point. The Holocaust had killed 6 million Jews in Europe, and international sympathy for survivors was immense. Tens of thousands of displaced Jews sought to enter Palestine, but British restrictions under the 1939 White Paper blocked many. Illegal immigration grew, and armed Jewish underground groups attacked British forces. By 1947, Britain admitted it could no longer manage the mandate and handed the issue to the United Nations. In November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly voted on Resolution 181, the Partition Plan. It proposed dividing Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem placed under international administration. The Jewish leadership accepted the plan despite concerns about borders. The Arab leadership rejected it, arguing that the majority population, Arab Palestinians, were being forced to surrender land to a minority. At the time, Jews made up about 1/3 of the population and owned less than 10% of the land, yet the plan allocated them 55% of the territory. Violence broke out immediately. From late 1947 into mid-1948, Palestine entered a civil war phase. Arab militias and volunteers attacked Jewish convoys and settlements. Jewish forces, including the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi, carried out military operations, captured villages, and in some cases, committed massacres such as at Deir Yassin in April 1948. By spring, many Palestinian villages were depopulated as residents fled fighting, were expelled, or left out of fear. On May 14, 1948, as the British withdrew, David Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel. Within hours, neighboring Arab states Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon invaded, starting the First Arab-Israeli War. Israel, initially on the defensive, managed to secure significant victories. By the 1949 armistice agreements, Israel controlled about 78% of the territory, far more than the United Nations partition had proposed. For Jews, this was the War of Independence, the moment a state was reborn after centuries. For Palestinians, it was the Nakba, meaning the catastrophe. Over 700,000 Palestinians became refugees, displaced into neighboring countries and territories such as Gaza, the West Bank, and Lebanon. At the same time, about 800,000 Jews were expelled or fled from Arab countries over the following years, many resettling in Israel. The war created two refugee crises, two narratives of survival and loss, and two irreconcilable memories. The borders left behind were not permanent peace lines, but armistice agreements known as the Green Line. These lines defined Israel, but left the West Bank under Jordanian rule and Gaza under Egyptian administration. Jerusalem was divided. The conflict had moved from potential compromise to open-ended war. The armistice agreements of 1949 did not bring peace. Instead, they froze the conflict without resolving its causes. Israel existed within the Green Line. The West Bank was annexed by Jordan, and Gaza was administered by Egypt. Jerusalem was divided between Israel in the west and Jordan in the east. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees remained in camps in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Gaza. Their right of return was denied by Israel, while host countries often restricted their integration. The border areas became flashpoints. Palestinian Fedayeen fighters, often operating from Gaza or Jordan, launched raids into Israel. These attacks targeted civilians as well as soldiers. Israel responded with military reprisals that struck villages and camps, causing high civilian casualties. This cycle hardened hostility and shaped a doctrine of deterrence in Israeli military thinking. The Suez Crisis of 1956 brought the conflict into global focus. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, angering Britain and France. Israel joined them in a coordinated attack on Egypt. Israeli forces captured Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula in less than a week. International pressure, led by the United States and the Soviet Union, forced Israel, Britain, and France to withdraw. The episode humiliated the old colonial powers, elevated Nasser as a leader of Arab nationalism, and showed that Israel could act as a regional power, but also that it was constrained by Cold War superpowers. In the following decade, the Palestinian issue remained unresolved. Refugees in camps grew in number, sustained by UNRWA aid, but with little prospect of return or resettlement. The Palestine Liberation Organization was founded in 1964 under the sponsorship of the Arab League, with the stated aim of reclaiming all of Palestine. Israel viewed the PLO as a threat to its existence. By the mid-1960s, regional tensions escalated. Border clashes with Syria increased over water projects and demilitarized zones. Jordan feared losing control of the Palestinian movement. Egypt's leadership presented itself as champion of the Arab cause, but also faced internal pressures. Israel, for its part, felt encircled and prepared for war. On the eve of 1967, the conflict was no closer to resolution than it had been in 1949. Instead, the lines of confrontation were deeper, and the next war was already approaching. In May 1967, regional tensions reached their peak. Egypt demanded the withdrawal of UN peacekeepers from the Sinai Peninsula and moved its army toward the Israeli border. President Nasser announced the closure of the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, which Israel had previously declared a cause for war. Jordan and Egypt signed a mutual defense pact, and other Arab states expressed solidarity. For Israel, the sense of encirclement became acute. On June 5th, Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt's air force, destroying most of it on the ground. Within 6 days, Israel had captured the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza from Egypt, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. The victory was swift and overwhelming. The borders of the conflict were transformed. For Israel, the war brought control of territories 3 times its original size. For many Jews, it was seen as a moment of national security and spiritual revival, especially with the capture of the old city of Jerusalem and the Western Wall. For Palestinians and Arabs, it was a disaster. Hundreds of thousands of new refugees fled or were displaced from the West Bank and Gaza. The occupation of these territories became the central issue of the conflict. The international response was shaped by United Nations Security Council Resolution 242, passed in November 1967. The resolution called for Israeli withdrawal from territories occupied in the conflict, and for the recognition of every state's right to live in peace. Its wording was deliberately ambiguous, leaving open the scope of withdrawal required. Israel emphasized the need for secure and defensible borders, while Arab states emphasized the principle of full withdrawal. This ambiguity ensured that the resolution became a reference point, but not a solution. The aftermath of the war also marked the beginning of the settlement project. Israeli governments encouraged or tolerated Jewish communities establishing outposts in the West Bank and Gaza, motivated by security, ideology, or religious attachment. For Palestinians, the occupation meant military rule, land confiscations, and restrictions on movement. The Six-Day War created the framework of the conflict that still endures. Israel became both stronger and more vulnerable. Palestinians became both more visible and more dispossessed. The lines drawn in June 1967 remain at the center of every negotiation and every confrontation that followed. The years after 1967 reshaped the Middle East. Israel now controlled the West Bank, Gaza, Sinai, and the Golan Heights. This occupation created new realities. For Palestinians, it meant military rule, land seizures, and the growth of refugee populations. For Israel, it meant strategic depth, but also responsibility for more than 1 million Palestinians under its control. The Palestine Liberation Organization, which had been formed in 1964, became more active after 1967. Under Yasser Arafat's leadership, it shifted from Arab League sponsorship to an independent movement claiming to represent the Palestinian people directly. Armed groups carried out raids and hijackings that attracted international attention. Jordan became a center of PLO activity, leading to conflict with the Jordanian monarchy. In 1970, the Jordanian army fought the PLO in what became known as Black September, killing thousands and expelling the organization to Lebanon. In Israel, the debate over the occupied territories grew. Some argued that the land should be traded for peace, consistent with the formula of Resolution 242. Others saw the West Bank, known in Hebrew as Judea and Samaria, as part of the historic homeland and began to build settlements. The government maintained ambiguity, allowing limited settlement while waiting for Arab positions to shift. The Arab states, led by Egypt and Syria, sought to reverse the outcome of 1967. Diplomatic attempts, including efforts by the United States and the Soviet Union, failed to bridge differences. Egypt demanded full Israeli withdrawal. Israel demanded recognition and secure borders before withdrawal. The stalemate deepened. Tensions rose along the Suez Canal, where Egypt and Israel fought artillery duels and commando raids in what was called the War of Attrition from 1969 to 1970. Casualties mounted without changing the strategic picture. When Egyptian President Nasser died in 1970, he was succeeded by Anwar Sadat, who promised to recover lost territory and restore Arab pride. By 1973, the Arab states prepared for a new confrontation. Egypt and Syria planned a coordinated attack to regain Sinai and the Golan. Israel believed that deterrence would hold and that no Arab state would risk another war so soon after 1967. That assumption would be tested in October 1973. On October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated attack against Israel. The date was chosen carefully. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, and many Israeli soldiers were away from their posts. The surprise was complete. Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal, breaching the Bar-Lev line of fortifications, while Syrian forces advanced into the Golan Heights. In the first days, Arab armies achieved significant gains. Egyptian troops established bridgeheads in Sinai under heavy Israeli losses. Syrian forces captured much of the Golan. For Israel, the initial shock created fears of collapse. But Israel mobilized quickly, reinforcements stabilized the front, and counterattacks began. Within a week, Israeli forces had pushed the Syrians back across the Golan and had crossed the Suez Canal into Egyptian territory. The war lasted less than 3 weeks, but its impact was profound. Over 2,500 Israelis were killed, a number proportionally devastating for a small population. Arab casualties were much higher, with tens of thousands of dead and wounded. The war restored Arab confidence after the humiliation of 1967, especially in Egypt, where the initial success was celebrated as a recovery of honor. For Israel, the war was a strategic victory, but also a psychological blow, proving that its security was not absolute. The global consequences were immediate. The oil-producing Arab states imposed an embargo, targeting countries that supported Israel. This triggered the 1973 oil crisis, quadrupling oil prices and shaking economies worldwide. The Cold War dimension was also sharp. The Soviet Union supplied Egypt and Syria, while the United States launched a massive airlift to support Israel. The confrontation brought Washington and Moscow close to direct conflict. The political outcome was significant. Egypt's President Sadat recognized that military force could not achieve the return of Sinai on its own, but that limited success on the battlefield had created leverage. Israel recognized that holding occupied territories indefinitely carried growing costs. These lessons opened the door to new diplomacy. Within a few years, the United States brokered disengagement agreements and then hosted negotiations at Camp David. The Yom Kippur War was not only a battle of armies, it reshaped regional politics, the global economy, and the trajectory of the conflict. It marked the end of one phase of the Arab-Israeli struggle and the beginning of another, where negotiations would matter as much as wars. The Yom Kippur War ended with new political realities. Both Egypt and Israel had fought hard, and both claimed partial success. Egypt regained a sense of pride, and Israel preserved its existence but at high cost. This balance of outcomes created an opening for diplomacy. In 1974 and 1975, disengagement agreements were signed under United States mediation. These agreements created buffer zones in Sinai, monitored by international forces, and reduced the immediate risk of war. Israel withdrew from some territory, but the larger question of Sinai remained unresolved. Egypt's President Anwar Sadat decided to shift strategy. He concluded that recovering Sinai required direct negotiation with Israel and the involvement of the United States. In 1977, Sadat made a dramatic visit to Jerusalem, speaking before the Israeli Knesset. It was the first time an Arab leader publicly recognized Israel's right to exist. The gesture shocked the Arab world and opened a path to peace talks. United States President Jimmy Carter invited Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to Camp David in 1978. After nearly 2 weeks of negotiations, they signed the Camp David Accords. The agreement had two parts. The first outlined a framework for Palestinian autonomy in the West Bank and Gaza, but it was vague and never fully implemented. The second provided for a full Israeli withdrawal from Sinai in exchange for Egyptian recognition of Israel. In 1979, the Egypt-Israel peace treaty was signed. Egypt regained the Sinai Peninsula in stages over the following years. Israel gained its first peace treaty with an Arab state and ended its longest military occupation. For the United States, it was a diplomatic triumph that strengthened its influence in the region. The treaty, however, also revealed limits. Other Arab states condemned Egypt for breaking Arab unity, and the Arab League suspended Egypt's membership. For Palestinians, the autonomy framework was seen as inadequate, and their cause was pushed aside. The settlement issue in the West Bank and Gaza continued to grow. The Camp David Accords marked a turning point. They ended the cycle of war between Egypt and Israel and showed that direct negotiation could succeed. At the same time, they highlighted the unresolved core of the conflict: the status of Palestinians and the territories occupied since 1967. By the late 1980s, the Palestinian issue returned to the center of the conflict. Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza had lasted 2 decades. Settlements expanded steadily, and Palestinians faced restrictions on movement, land use, and political activity. Discontent grew, particularly among younger generations who had known nothing but occupation. In December 1987, the First Intifada began. It started in Gaza after a traffic accident involving an Israeli military vehicle killed 4 Palestinians. Protests spread quickly across the territories. The uprising was largely grassroots, driven by students, workers, and local committees. Palestinians used strikes, boycotts, and demonstrations. There were also violent clashes, including stone throwing, Molotov cocktails, and occasional armed attacks. Israel responded with military force, curfews, and mass arrests. Thousands were killed or injured, and many more were imprisoned. The Intifada changed international perceptions. Palestinians were no longer seen only through the lens of terrorism or exile politics. Television images of youths confronting soldiers brought global attention to the daily realities of occupation. The uprising also weakened Jordan's claim to represent Palestinians, leaving the PLO as the recognized voice of their cause. By the early 1990s, new opportunities for diplomacy appeared. The Cold War was ending. The United States was emerging as the sole superpower, and regional alignments shifted after the Gulf War of 1991. The Madrid Conference opened the door to negotiations between Israel, Arab states, and Palestinians. The breakthrough came in 1993 with the Oslo Accords. Negotiated secretly in Norway, They brought mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO. Israel accepted the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. The PLO recognized Israel's right to exist and renounced terrorism. The Accords created the Palestinian Authority to administer parts of the West Bank and Gaza. The territories were divided into areas A, B, and C, with different levels of Palestinian and Israeli control. Oslo was hailed as historic. For the first time, Israelis and Palestinians shook hands on the White House lawn, yet it left the hardest issues unresolved: borders, Jerusalem, refugees, and settlements. Supporters saw it as a path toward peace. Critics on both sides saw it as a trap. For Palestinians, life under occupation continued, and settlements grew. For Israelis, terrorism did not stop, and security remained fragile. The First Intifada and Oslo together marked a shift. They brought the Palestinian issue back into diplomacy and gave Palestinians limited self-rule for the first time. But they also created expectations that would be hard to fulfill, setting the stage for disappointment and renewed violence. The optimism of Oslo faded quickly. By the late 1990s, progress had stalled. Israeli settlements expanded. Final status talks failed to produce agreement, and Palestinians saw little change in daily life under occupation. Extremist violence on both sides deepened mistrust. In 1995, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who had signed the Oslo Accords, was assassinated by a Jewish extremist opposed to concessions. The immediate trigger for the Second Intifada came in September 2000, when Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon visited the Temple Mount, known to Muslims as Haram al-Sharif. The site is holy to both Jews and Muslims, and the visit was seen as a provocation. Protests erupted and spread into a violent uprising. Unlike the largely unarmed First Intifada, the Second Intifada involved organized armed attacks, suicide bombings, and Israeli military operations. The violence was devastating. Between 2000 and 2005, thousands of Palestinians and Israelis were killed. Suicide bombings struck buses, cafes, and markets inside Israel. The Israeli military launched large-scale incursions into West Bank cities, imposed curfews, and carried out targeted killings of militant leaders. The conflict eroded hopes of coexistence and hardened attitudes on both sides. One of the most lasting consequences was the construction of the separation barrier. Beginning in 2002, Israel built a network of walls and fences along and inside the West Bank. Israel argued that it was necessary to stop suicide bombings, and indeed, the attacks declined sharply after its construction. Palestinians argued that the barrier confiscated land, divided communities, and entrenched occupation. The International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion in 2004, declaring the barrier illegal under international law, but Israel rejected this view. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew its settlers and military from Gaza. Prime Minister Ariel Sharon argued that Israel could not indefinitely hold the territory. While Palestinians celebrated the end of settlements in Gaza, Israel maintained control of borders, airspace, and coastal waters. The withdrawal left a power vacuum that became a central issue in the years to come. The Second Intifada marked the collapse of the Oslo vision. It entrenched separation, fueled radicalization, and left both societies scarred. For many Israelis, it proved that concessions brought insecurity. For many Palestinians, it proved that negotiations brought no real independence. The cycle of violence and mistrust deepened, shaping the next stage of the conflict. The withdrawal of Israel from Gaza in 2005 reshaped Palestinian politics. In 2006, parliamentary elections were held in the Palestinian territories. Hamas, an Islamist movement founded during the First Intifada, won a majority of seats. Hamas rejected recognition of Israel and maintained an armed wing. The victory shocked Israel, the United States, and the European Union, which considered Hamas a terrorist organization. Tensions between Hamas and the rival Fatah movement escalated into open fighting. In 2007, Hamas took full control of Gaza, expelling Fatah forces. The Palestinian Authority, dominated by Fatah, continued to govern the West Bank. This split created two separate administrations, one in Gaza and one in the West Bank, a division that persists today. Israel and Egypt imposed a blockade on Gaza, restricting the movement of goods and people. Israel argued that the blockade was necessary to prevent weapons smuggling. Palestinians described it as collective punishment that deepened poverty and isolation. International organizations reported severe humanitarian conditions. The Gaza conflict soon turned violent. Rocket fire from Gaza targeted Israeli towns, while Israeli airstrikes and ground operations sought to weaken Hamas. Major escalations occurred in 2008 to 2009, 2012, and 2014. Each round caused heavy civilian casualties, particularly in Gaza, where population density and lack of infrastructure magnified the impact. Thousands of Palestinians were killed, and hundreds of Israelis died, mostly civilians, under rocket fire. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the situation failed repeatedly. Ceasefires brokered by Egypt or the United Nations ended fighting temporarily, but did not address core issues. The blockade continued. Hamas remained entrenched in Gaza, and Fatah maintained control of the West Bank. By the 2010s, the conflict had become defined by cycles of violence and stalemate. Gaza remained isolated and devastated, while in the West Bank, Israeli settlement expansion accelerated. Peace negotiations were attempted, including efforts by the United States, but no breakthrough occurred. Both societies grew more skeptical of compromise, and international attention shifted to other regional crises, including the wars in Iraq and Syria. The period from 2006 through the 2010s confirmed that the conflict had entered a new phase. The two-state solution was still spoken of, but conditions on the ground made it increasingly difficult. The division of Palestinian leadership, the blockade of Gaza, and the continued occupation of the West Bank hardened realities that would shape the next decade. The decade of the 2010s reinforced both division and change. In the West Bank, Israeli settlements expanded steadily. By the late 2010s, more than 400,000 Israelis lived in West Bank settlements, with another 200,000 in East Jerusalem. Successive Israeli governments supported expansion, either directly or through legal and financial measures. Palestinians viewed this as the steady erosion of land needed for a state. International law bodies, including the United Nations, considered the settlements illegal, but Israel disputed this interpretation. In Gaza, the blockade continued. Periodic escalations occurred in 2012, 2014, 2021, and 2023, each producing high civilian casualties. Israeli officials emphasized the threat of rockets and tunnels, while humanitarian organizations emphasized the toll on Gaza's civilian population. Gaza became a symbol of suffering for Palestinians and a focus of Israeli security concern. Palestinian politics remained divided. Efforts at reconciliation between Hamas in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank repeatedly failed. The lack of unified leadership weakened Palestinian diplomacy and complicated negotiations with Israel and the international community. The broader region, however, began to shift. In 2020, the Abraham Accords brought normalization agreements between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and later Sudan. These agreements marked a major diplomatic breakthrough for Israel, reducing its isolation in the Arab world. Palestinians, however, saw the accords as a betrayal, since they were achieved without addressing occupation or statehood. At the international level, support and criticism became polarized. The United States recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital in 2017 and moved its embassy, a decision celebrated in Israel but condemned by Palestinians and many others. Europe remained divided on how to engage, and regional powers such as Turkey, Iran, and Qatar increased their involvement. By the early 2020s, the conflict had reached a paradox. Israel was stronger diplomatically and militarily than ever before, but the Palestinian issue remained unresolved. Millions of Palestinians continued to live under occupation or blockade, with no clear path to statehood. Cycles of violence, political division, and competing narratives ensured that the conflict remained one of the most enduring and contentious in the modern world. The Arab-Israeli conflict endures because its central questions remain unsettled. Borders remain disputed. Israel insists on security guarantees and defensible lines, while Palestinians seek a state in the West Bank and Gaza, with East Jerusalem as its capital. Jerusalem itself is contested. Israel regards it as its united capital, but Palestinians view the eastern part as their own future capital. Because the city is sacred to Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike, compromise has proven nearly impossible. The refugee question is another unresolved issue. More than 700,000 Palestinians were displaced in 1948, and their descendants now number in the millions. Palestinians demand the right to return. Israel rejects this, fearing it would alter the demographic balance and undermine the Jewish character of the state. Settlements have deepened the divide. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis live in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Palestinians view the settlements as illegal and as a barrier to statehood ease. Israel, however, considers many of them permanent and strategically important. Palestinian politics remain split between the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza. This division weakens negotiations and sustains different approaches to Israel. For Israel, the split confirms doubts about whether there is a unified Palestinian partner for peace. The future is uncertain. A two-state solution remains the most widely cited formula, but each passing year of settlement growth and political mistrust makes it harder. Some speak of a single state with equal rights, though both sides fear that such a model would erase their national identity. Others suggest shared sovereignty or confederation, but these remain theoretical. For now, the most likely outcome is the continuation of the status quo. Intermittent violence, partial diplomacy, and a conflict that remains unresolved but never disappears.